I do want to stress that although this is a panel discussion, we'd very much like to involve everybody in this engagement, which has been an extremely interesting and provocative 2 sessions that Sue's given us. And I think it deserves a real putting our heads together as much as we can in the room. So although I'm certainly going to ask our panelists to talk to some of the points, at the same time I'd like to give a lot of space to you to come in wherever you feel comfortable and want to contribute. Let me introduce the panel. Sue Parnell, I think all of you know. Is there anybody here who wasn't at the first 2 sessions? Okay, right. Okay. Well, so Sue is the one who's been presenting to us, and I'm going to summarize some of the arguments that she's made. On my left is Professor Thandika Mkandawire, who is the former director of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. And interestingly, he's the first chair of African development at the LSE, which is, I think, a really important position from which to enter our debate. But what also interested me was that you were formerly the director of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa. And that position in particular is important to the kinds of debates we've been having about theory and knowledge that is applicable in an African context. So thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. And on my right is Professor Yves Cavan, who is the Professor of Development Planning in the DPU. And I think Yves brings to the panel many things, but in addition to perspectives on Africa, and interestingly, I think Francophone Africa as much as English-speaking Africa, also brings a very strong Latin American experience, which I hope will also contribute to our discussions. And on the end is Julio Davila, who is the director of our PhD program in the DPU. And Julio, although he works predominantly in Latin America, has a lot of African and Asian experience. So, and I think you've heard many of his comments already in the previous discussions, and I think also will bring quite an international perspective to some of the issues that we're going to raise. Now, Sue presented us with a fairly provocative start, a set of propositions, in which she basically stated that the current urban and planning theory that we have is actually unsuitable to navigate the complex realities of African urban situations that we face today. And she then proposed a set of ways in which we might look at alternatives to develop a more effective way of looking from a theoretical perspective and trying to understand that, but linked very much, and I was very much drawn to the last proposition you make, to engage theory and theoretically informed reflexive policy. So talking about theoretically informed reflexive practice, it would be for me, which would require a multidisciplinary platform in order to build up some kind of alternative way of understanding and developing urban theory that means something in the context of African cities, but more widely in cities of the global south. Now, Sue then proposed what she called Act 1 and Act 2, which in a sense I think is a good way of laying out the drama. And Act 1 was around the need to decenter the dominant discourses of the city, since they were no longer suitable. And the second, Act 2, was to find alternative modes of urban theorization or practice that reveal more about southern cities. In the second lecture, she then took us into Africa and into African cities, and again presented us with 2 propositions. The first one around African cities and the current and future challenges of African cities the first proposition was that climate change challenge had actually been misconstrued for Africa. And she then argued around how, in fact, migration was not going to be as important, and certainly environmentally, climate change-based migration was not going to be so important to African urbanization as many had proposed, and that African cities were going to primarily grow out of natural increase. And I think complementary work to that by Debbie Potts implies that that growth actually may be slower than what we even anticipated, or what the experts anticipated. The second proposition, which is, I think, directly in the field of interest, more than I say of interest because it's all in our field of interest, but directly relevant to the DPU because it had linked straight to planning, which was around the proposition that actually efforts by urban planners to improve African cities would be more effective if they focused on removing the legacies and the continuities of segregation and segregatory practices than on the more, what appears to be more fashionable contemporary concern with informality. So again, this was a fairly stark challenge to present to us. And what I'd like to propose is that we actually start not at the beginning of where you started, but to start with the situation of African cities, and perhaps talk a little bit about the concrete reality of how we can understand them, and then to discuss the question of segregation and informality and the way in which planning addresses them. And then through that process, perhaps we can start alluding to the theoretical and the wider paradigms that might help and inform. And Sue presented us with a number of options, which I think we can explore in more detail. I would like to say, open up and say, you started with this proposition in your second session on that climate change challenge has been misconstrued for Africa. And I suppose what I'd like to open up the discussion by asking our panel, saying, is this actually the focus of what we need to think about in future African cities? Or should we be focusing perhaps more on understanding what the potential is of different communities to adapt in contexts of vulnerability, and how do we understand vulnerability in African cities?
Talking about these things, my mind sort of this comes back to Latin America and what's happening in Latin America. And I don't mean to say that there's a linear trajectory and Latin America is ahead of Africa, but it is in some ways, in the sense that it's a much more urbanized continent. And it's a continent where the processes of capital accumulation have gone far ahead of those in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And what is worrying in Latin America is, and what we ought to learn from Latin America, take back to Africa, is the degree of fragmentation, segmentation, and inequality that has been coalescing in cities in Latin America. And perhaps look at the praxis of how cities and local governments that have been progressive enough, and Yves can sort of put in his comments on this, what they have done to try and rebalance those inequalities. Because you can try and rebalance inequalities at a national level through taxation, and clearly that's probably the best means of doing it. And through sort of policies which are of a macro nature, which capture extra value from some sections of the population and sections of capital accumulation and distributed somewhere else. But there's also some degree of intervention that you can have in the local level, which is what some of our work in Latin America has been showing, is that there is room for maneuver, as our colleague Michael Sefiu would call it, at the local level, where you can actually try and rebalance those enormous levels of fragmentation. But that also requires giving local governments a much stronger set of instruments to cope with that. So whether which is in a way what Debbie Potts has been arguing, and you've been arguing, that they've been crying that they have masses and masses of population, much more than they actually have, partly as a way of clawing some of those natural budgets or resources. But on the other hand, whether they're right or not, I mean, they do need those resources because historically they have not received them. And as we know, and Sue mentioned that, aid has largely been going to rural areas, not to urban areas. And so urban areas are not equipped to cope with that. And I would say that there are lessons that we learn.
Yeah, first of all, I think that the way we think about African cities is usually quite a historical, and therefore we see migration patterns as if they were the same in Africa. I prefer to use the sort of thinking by Samir Amin about how African countries were integrated. And he divides Africa into three Africas. The Africa of cash crop, that's West Africa. The Africa of the concessions of the Congo and Gabon, and then the Africa of the labor reserves. And if you take the two extremes, the cash crop and the labor reserve, that's Southern Africa mostly, the cities are very different, and the use of space is entirely different. In West Africa, the colonial interest was in the movement of the crops, not of people. So there was no legislation about how people moved. A lot of law knows about how you move crops. You couldn't move crops from Ghana to Ivory Coast, but people could move, and so the cities have basically grown more organically than in Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, they were shaped by labor reserve townships. I was myself a product of townships, and one of my big surprises in my life when I went to West Africa was that I heard somebody at 7 in the morning in Dakar playing a drum. Now, in a labor reserve economy, you don't play drums in money because you're supposed to play them between 2 and 5, when the mining company allowed you to play drums. Anyway, the point is that, so when you look at the city centers in West Africa and those in South, they're very different stories. And I think the discrimination for most texts is very different, one from Southern Africa and from West Africa. And I once wrote a paper for the ILO, because ILO was working on the informal sector in Zambia, and they were quite upset that it wasn't as developed as in West Africa. So I tried to explain to them that in Southern Africa, you were not allowed to be, there was no informal sector until quite recently. And because you could not be, if you're a black person, you could not be in the city unless you're employed by the caste system. In West Africa, there wasn't an informal sector, so you cannot simply recommend for Zambia the same thing Senegal or Accra had. And I think the debate about urbanization in Africa has the same problem. We have not yet dealt with that. These are three different patterns of urbanization with very different dynamics and probably very different policy implications.
Yes. I think that's very valuable. Yeah.
I would like just to continue on that notion of diversity and the ambition to speak of African cities as an object is pretty ambitious, I would say, and maybe part of a vision of the West who wants to homogenize something which is difficult to homogenize. Because I'm looking at cities in North Africa, which are part of Africa. So you start there, you start from Morocco down to Egypt. I mean, these are cities, for some of them, thousands of years old. So and we use the same kind of in which were great civilizations, which is still there. So this notion of wanting to speak in abstract of African cities at that stage, I think is over ambitious, and we should start from local processes. The second observation for me, and it goes very much on what you are saying, Guga, is that I see and compare how decentralization processes, I mean, this transferring power to local authorities, has been affecting tremendously what we were speaking about, in terms of planning, in terms of redistribution of wealth, in terms of people's participation. And once it turned out with we saw the effect in Latin America on this of decentralization and local governments having more power. And now this is an ongoing movement in Africa as a whole, even if some African cities have no mayors, like if you go to Angola, there is no elected mayor. The laws on decentralization in République démocratique du Congo, in Congo, is there, but mayors are not elected. So it's very different. And I'm impressed about the difference between the places where decentralization is deep and start to be ingrained with some effect, Senegal versus even Congo. And therefore, I think one discriminant to understand the diversity has to do with precisely the decentralization process and the nature of the decentralization process. And I think that to understand, at least that's my take, to understand a little bit this diversity and the difference of processes, it's interesting to have an issue. Like, for instance, I was looking at participatory budgeting, which is one area I work upon. So if you ask what's happening in Africa on participatory budgeting, they will say, nothing. This is something from Porto Alegre, for those who know, or Latin America. Started in 2003, Cameroon, and today I just finished the work on that. 162 cities have been implementing in 22 countries out of the 54 processes of different natures of participatory budgeting. If you look at the quantity of research on that, it's virtually nil. And what is interesting is if you look at the cities which have been implementing, many of them are small, intermediate, or big. So it shows that innovations in managing cities and planning cities are not necessarily where the urban research is taking place, which is basically the big cities. So for me, it's quite interesting to look at innovation versus research and understanding, because if we look at the large cities where research is being done, we are unable, I can tell you, out of 162 cities, probably you will have 10. How are we going to understand the processes of change, which is the end of research, I mean, this transformative effect? For me, it's a true challenge that I would like to share with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the points which are being made are really valuable, and I think just in terms of the issue about differentiation, absolutely crucial. And the point of starting from the climate change debate as it is currently framed is that I don't know that the climate impetus for development negates a differentiated focus. I think that would be a false accusation. In other words, I think that there will be quite a lot of effort on downscaling. I think the focus on adaptation means that you probably will get quite a lot of local bubbling up. It doesn't actually mitigate against a differentiated focus. So I think we need to be careful that how we respond back to that work. What I think it doesn't do, Nelly, is, or what it's done is that it's put the demographic question into the agenda in a way that it hasn't been before. In other words, and that's quite useful because I think we've ignored the demographic question really quite significantly. I have to say I would be quite careful in how we word things, and I'm really mindful of the work that Africa Research Institute launched today. And I think the essence of it is absolutely right. You've got to be careful of the message that you take home. And that the message there is that urbanization is not as fast as you thought it was. Okay. That it is more differentiated than we thought that it was. But it is not a message that cities are not growing. Okay. Cities in Africa are growing. And they're growing fast. 3.5%. Maybe growing at a declining rate, but they are growing unambiguously. And getting that handle, and I think the points that people have been making about devolution and understanding the differentiated form of devolution in response to this demographic transition and this varied demographic transition is the one that becomes really important. And it's in that interface where I think the climate work is not going. It's not understanding that. So the climate work has sort of typified everybody as simply moving from rural to urban. And the kickback on that is to say, no, that's crude. Okay. And what I think is being said by the panel is that it's crude, and what it misses is what are the really important demographic trends which interface with these devolved processes and regionally different processes in particular ways. But we've got to be very specific about what we're saying in response back to that community, because it's going to be the strong driver of most of the development, or a lot of
the development action in particular kinds of ways. And so that was the reason really for tackling, if you like, the climate entry point into African cities. And I completely agree with it. It does need to come in inverted commas as a not particularly useful concept, and perhaps even more so than in other regions. I know the sort of Asian community always balk at the idea of all Asian cities being the same. And it's even more ridiculous in a sense in the African context.
I don't know if anybody wants to pick up any of these points around the climate change interpretation.
Perhaps just to say, I'm Vanessa Castambroda, I'm a lecturer at the DBU. Just to say that the climate entry point can be characterized as that focuses on demographic changes, but actually the climate entry point, for me, it would be completely different. It would be perhaps more a focus on the patterns of spatial inequality that emerge as a result of climate change, and perhaps a consideration, often like concerns with adaptation are often linked to a consideration of risks that were already there, but perhaps are exacerbated. We have to consider them in another dimension. And links with mitigation, I think the entry point there will be about thinking about what is the connections with the city with the global economy and how that relates with the overall ecological processes that are associated to capital accumulation and so on. So I think the climate change entry point can give you very interesting avenues, other than thinking about migration and the rural-urban linkages.
I mean, if one looked at the experiences of very dramatic changes of urban population after when there are refugee problems, and, I think one can learn something that might happen when the climate change becomes more effective. That, again, cities in West Africa are more, they kind of more refugee-friendly, like, than in Southern Africa. In Southern Africa, you immediately become criminalized. Because you just can't walk into Johannesburg, which you could in Dakar, basically, you can walk into Dakar. And that probably the cities of Southern Africa are the least prepared for massive inflow of people. I mean, they may have more money, but I think the culture of those cities and especially the use of space is much more restrictive than, say, West Africa. And I think it'd be interesting just for comparative reasons to see how refugees have fared, you know, in these two different cities when they've come, say, to Nairobi or go to Dakar. I mean, these are massive changes. And my suspicion is that there's greater criminalization of large numbers of people moving into the cities in Southern Africa than West Africa. And those, I think I find cities as extremely conservative places to be in terms of, once a space is set, it takes a very long time to change, you know. I mean, it's heavy physical infrastructure is there, you know. And those are probably some of the mechanisms that will affect how Africa responds to climate change. Who can come in, who cannot come in, and what conditions.
When Talika was talking, I was trying to think back to the history of Latin America and whether it's differentiated in a similar way. And I find, I mean, even taking a country like Colombia or Brazil, I mean, you do find sort of regional responses within that which are slightly different. I mean, clearly a port city like Barranquilla, which I've been discovering recently as a sort of port city in northern Colombia and the Caribbean. It's a fascinating place, but partly because it was a port city. Colombia doesn't have any port cities. And it's a city that received a lot of international migration. Colombia is not known for its international migration. Whereas Argentina is, Brazil is, to some extent Venezuela, because it's since the oil boom in the 1930s. And it's a much more open city with much greater levels of creativity. I mean, I don't know if everybody's heard of, or who's heard of Shakira, I mean, the singer, but she comes from Barranquilla, and only Barranquilla could produce Shakira. It's that openness and that which the capital city Bogotá doesn't have. Bogotá is a very conservative city. You know, it's very hard to break the mold. It's a sort of stuffy, old, up in the clouds, 1,000 kilometers from the coast kind of environment. Very inward looking and very isolated. Barranquilla is a much more open city. So to some extent those patterns which have geographical dimension, and therefore sort of add to the cultural dimension or inspire that cultural dimension ought to be taken into account. So it's very valuable. I think it's a very valuable insight. I think that you've given us to think about Latin America.
To add to diversity and this issue of climate change again, I think that if you look at the research which are being done, I see very little being done on the island cities of Africa. And when there was the state of African cities which was being done, I remember that I participated in the early stages on the state of African cities, and it was a kind of international vision that Africa was a continent, leaving aside places like Cabo Verde, like Comoran, Seychelles, etc., Madagascar, to name a few. And so our vision of Africa is very much linked to I would say, a very continental, self-centered, without working diversity. So that's why I think that it's absolutely essential when we speak about climate change to try to be concrete on the places which might be affected, and I think that's this island. And another experience I would like to share with you is the very little permeability of mayors and association of mayors of the United Cities and Local Government for Africa, which is the African Association of Mayors, and they regularly meet at Africité every 3 years. If you try to have the debate on climate change, this is a very difficult concern to bring in, despite the point. But what is interesting is, if we want to make research which would be rooted in realities, what swept really, took the whole issue, was to think cities from the periphery. So there's a forum, which is Forum of Local Authorities, from the periphery of these places, which are new local governments, let's say not Dakar per se, but this community. And here, there is a very great interest to understand fragmentation from the outside and not from the core. And it has given a couple of very interesting reflections on peripheries being an element of understanding cities, being from West, Central, and East Africa. These are forums where I see a lot of discussion taking place, understanding the nature of the periphery of African cities, and not African cities, but their periphery, and how they are. Because it reflects to segregation, and then I would like to go back to what you said. I think the issue on segregation versus informality is not either or, it's what are the links between precisely segregation and informality? Are there any links there or not? Theoretically speaking, how are we going to explain both elements? And I think that they are part of an equation which is not well solved. You know? And the easiest way is to say it's either or. Let's work more on segregation. No, it's what are the links? Does informality provokes more segregation in cities or not? But we know that it's one of the motors of the economy. I'm not sure of the answer.
I think also a factor to enter this discussion is that planning actually hasn't been very good at dealing with informality at all. And in fact, because it's been so bad at it, it's actually contributed to segregation. So I think to present it as two separate issues, I think problematic in the sense. And I'm not sure that you meant it that way at all. And it's true that there is a lot of debate and focus on questions of informality. But again, looking at the diversity, the kind of three regional diversities that you presented in an African context, the way that segregation would be understood in those different contexts, I think would be very different. Informality might, and indeed the emergence of informality, as you said, is also very different in the way that those patterns have emerged over time.
Yeah, I mean, coming from Southern Africa, I'm not very comfortable with the expressive segregation being used in West Africa, in the sense that there's differentiation, yes, but this does not mean the segregation is. In the sense of, if you go to Dakar, it's quite obvious there's huge differentiation. but you don't feel that spaces are exclusive, that people are not, you can walk in Dhaka almost anywhere in that sense. So I have a very southern view of segregation, which is distorted. But I was, really intrigued by this question of the city and climate change in Africa. I think the debate on climate change in Africa is conducted at a level where Africans are totally passive. Things will happen to them, and so we don't see the city as one of the instruments for addressing climate change. We see it as a victim of climate change. It'll be crowded, people will come in from all over the place, and we don't. And the debate about Africa is not that in fact the cities must be prepared deliberately to address the climate change, either as recipients of people coming in. But the way it's posed now, it's posed as if these people out there are a threat to this thing called the city, which passively is stuck with millions of people coming in. And unfortunately, that is a whole debate still on African, when you go to the international conference, Africa is a victim, but there is no suggestion of how Africans will respond. Except say plant more trees, but there's really no serious response that we will need more energy, we will need more industrialization, we will need more mastery of water, and therefore make our cities take more people than they're doing now. And that way of thinking about the city, not as a victim, but as a lead response to climate change. I think we ought to begin to think in those terms for those who are planning cities, to begin to plan these cities not as victims of some horrible migration pattern, but as the core of a national response to climate change. That's how I would put that.
Yeah, leading the way in that is in fact not necessarily governments, but it's communities doing a lot of collective and mobilizing work around starting to address those issues, often without much support from government. And on the other hand, the fact that you have, what did you say, 62 cases, 162 cases of participatory budgeting implies a level of activism to deal with the problems of cities, which belies a kind of...
This is partly because the way the city has been treated in the last 20, 30 years, the urban bias thesis and all that, has made governments not seek money for it. Even in the aid debate, you don't go and ask money for the city, because that's, then you're accused of having an urban bias. The city has actually, from national governments, they cannot, it's not part of, it cannot be part of the so-called development policy anymore, because you'll be accused of urban bias if you talk about the city. That's why, and it's much more money if you are a small town or small enterprise. There, more NGOs go there, more, the city is in a way isolated politically, both seen as urban bias. I'm speaking as a city born against defending our cities, because our cities have been accused of all kinds of crimes.
That's true.
That's
Can I raise a question that seems to be cropping up again and again? I attended your last lecture, which was very interesting. It's to do with this adoption or abandonment of planning as a way of actually addressing this. Because on the one hand, we are talking about the wonderfulness of informality and the awfulness of the regulatory forces that are being imposed on people. And I'm curious to know whether or not people on the panel think that you can actually respond to the challenges through the informal process better than you can respond to the challenges through the regulatory plan processes. Because it seems to me that the regulatory plan processes are being imposed on people rather than growing from the people. That's part of the resistance. People are planning for other people, but they're different people. And this is part of the difficulty in accepting the legitimacy of planning, which suddenly becomes a tool for some other purpose. And we can see how it works in developed countries and developed cities. You can see how the planning system becomes manipulated for things which it was never intended to do. And I can imagine that in less developed contexts, it's even more manipulable for those purposes. And so I'm just wondering whether or not, on the one hand, we reject planning as a way of ordering ourselves because we don't want to be ordered, or we don't want other people to order us, or whether or not we look at informal settlements and informal evolutions of cities as actually offering a response which, from a technocratic point of view, doesn't seem to me to be able to deliver the standards that we require. In other words, clean water, ways of getting the sewage out, and ways of getting things in. These are fundamental technocratic things which haven't evolved informally. They have to come through a regulatory process.
Yeah. As we were speaking, I was thinking of what's happening in Mozambique, where we've been working, various of us, during a couple of years on the balance of the 10 years of decentralization and thinking urbanization. And I was impressed to see in Dondo, which is a small city in the central part of Mozambique, close to Beira, the second large city, historically, from Beira, on how they had been concentrating planning, not at city level, just because on the district, what is called the city, was Cemento, which means the colonial city, the suburbs and the rural, but trying to, on the 10 neighborhoods, to have local development plans for them. And I think that this scale of local development plan, which is something that participatory budgeting really many times ends up to, are territories that are quite well done in terms of planning. When you look at the plans which are being done, they are not only interesting from the normative point of view or the coherence that you get between projects or investment, they are quite interesting because through the planning process, what I saw in Dondo, and they won the African Award for good cities and good planning at the last AfriCite, is that through the planning process, and it was just as important as the result, you had for the first time the old structure Marxist-Leninist Frelimo Liberation Party, which was for the first time probably having a good dialogue with the old base of chiefs, of traditional chiefs, and all the new NGOs which are just popping around with the neoliberal times that Mozambique is facing today. And I could see that the mayor and the team were able to set up a process, call it a planning process or call it another process, by which at least what they come up to. So the process was building a new kind of governance, multi-actor system. But what I found fascinating is that through this planning process, they decided on 3 different actions, and this is where I see many weakness of the planning process from the top, and taking buying very much what Karen is saying. When it starts from the bottom, as it was there, through the people and through the multi-stakeholders and the mayors, they divided all their actions they had to do in 3 things. 1, commitments that we can take as a community, cleaning a street, making the ditch. The second, where do we need the minimum resource from the municipality? We are able to build a school, but we have not the money to put the wires and to put bulbs. And the second, that should be in the hands of the municipality, like renewing the market to get new taxes, etc. What I thought fascinating is that it was not only a planning process, which was generating a new political framework, but it was a way to have very targeted and very well thought of investments for any of the needs which were felt by people. And then gradually, the process of planning from the neighborhood could come on something which is still underway, which is putting all these pieces of the puzzle together, which is pretty difficult for being urban, suburban, and rural. So I think that when you look closely at what's happening in African cities, as a matter of fact, there's a lot happening in local development planning through different entries, either sectorial or through a territory, and we have not probably enough capacity of research to document and to research it. And this I can say on the 162 cities I was mentioning. I don't know, and this is something I look into very carefully for the last 10 years. If you have 10 works, 10 things which are written, it's a lot on 162. There's a true deficit on how planning is being practiced. And therefore, we have the old theories, and I agree with you, all theories that are there, but without being challenged by what's happening in the field and in the ground. So the deficit of research is so tremendous on that. But planning is there. I mean, in some places.
So what you're saying is that there is innovation.
Yes.
It's not a matter of, you know, either informality or top-down planning, but there is innovation happening and I think that's true, the finding of many of our research in different parts of.
But wait a minute, look, you know, if we're talking about mega cities here, you know, some of them are very large cities, and large cities have to plan. If you don't plan large cities, you have a big mess. The new mayors of these cities are aware of that. If you talk to the governor of Lagos, they're aware of these problems. You know, there's a lot of debate about how cities actually, the way they've grown in the last 30 years was completely unplanned. For many reasons. One, the state stopped planning. There was no planning anyway. At any level, there was simply no planning. But these cities have to be planned. I mean, if you and compared to what's happening in Asia and compared to what's happening in Africa, the African cities are in a mess in terms of there's simply no planning. I mean, and we find ways of planning these cities. If we don't do that, and this is where the danger of decentralization comes in, the elite, the middle class will plan their way out. And they will leave these cities to collapse. People are talking about having franchise cities. I mean, this will happen if we don't watch out. They will find, I was amazed when you go to West Africans, when you talk to West Africans and they go to Southern Africa and they're so impressed with our cities. Oh, they're so clean, they're so clean. And Nigerians actually replicated it through Abuja. Abuja is like an apartheid city. And so if we don't see these things as entities that have to be somehow planned, and we focus on, in a way of decentralization without seeing that you can actually, in the process, create an escape route for the elite. So decentralize if you want, you can take care of the mess. We will move into our own, which was in a way the apartheid model was. It was decentralization in that sense. And it is happening in these ghetted cities already, which are emerging in Africa, where the elite are pulling out of the normal city. I think, and the less planning you have for the city, the more you encourage that. I think we just have to be aware of the dynamics of, look, urban planning, I think, must relate to the physical status of the city. Who is going to finance all these things? And you're not going to finance that unless you get the middle class involved in it, because they're paying for some of it. And they're not going to invest that if they don't think the city is being planned. They will find their own areas where they're cut off.
Yeah, but there's one, I react immediately on one thing, that many of the planned and the role of planners today is to support massive evictions that are taking place for the benefit of the neoliberal system and for an accumulation of capital. If you look at Zimbabwe, 1 million people were displaced. That's probably one of the big one. And an excellent researcher from Zimbabwe made his thesis on papers and looked carefully on who were responsible. Is it Mugabe only and his thugs to displace 1 million people and have their houses being self-destroyed? Or was it different? And he analyzed carefully. And what was interesting is that fundamentally, not in Bulawayo, but in the capital city, the planners and the planning rules and the planning norms, and it's technically now demonstrated, a piece of research which is fabulous, it's demonstrating that the planners trained through the old British system have been the instrument, along with the existing plans, to displace people. You go to Port Harcourt, Nigeria, 300,000 people threatened. If you look at what are the instruments today to technically, nationally displace people, you go again to the same plan, which is in the hands of interest people who want to have the people along the river being displaced, to have proper global cities or CBDs, etc. So I agree with you, but making the following difference. It's not about planning per se, I'm the first one to defend planning for sure. I mean, cities which are not planned are a mess. I agree with you on that side. But today, the plans as they are practiced and designed are a tool for evictions at the service of not the people, but the investment in cities. And if you look, for instance, at even the cities development strategies model, I mean Habitat and CDS, which is like the tarte à la crème of planning, what they are proposing is, at the end of the day, bankable projects. So when you start and ending up the planning system with bankable projects, I mean, you know what you are going for, it's investment. And then the planning becomes another tool to displace people. So I'm very concerned about the nature of planning, not planning per se, and differentiating between how it is used today as a massive tool of displacement and not as a way to have spatial justice.
Yes.
I would like, regarding to what you just said, so what would be the alternative to that, to this model of planning that you are criticizing, or what the US doing? What would be an alternative then? Is there any alternative to that the current model of planning?
No, precisely. You know, you have some processes which have been implemented largely, for instance, by the Urban Management Program in over 150 cities, and 30 of them in Africa, which were called city consultations.
So that's a participatory budgeting that you were saying?
No, participatory budgeting is another tool which is leading precisely to planning in various places. I could speak about Yaoundé 6, for instance, in Cameroon, Yaoundé 2, more recently it's in Douala, where you have, through the discussion of the public money, very issue-based, the rebuilding of a planning at neighborhood and at larger scale. You know, you take Bombo in Kinshasa, 700,000. So you have processes which can be top-down, but ending up in a planning with norms and standards, etc. I believe very much in the possibilities of what has been done, which are the city consultations, which are participatory planning processes, which have worked beautifully well, or strategic planning like in Rosario, which is now one of the reference for African cities as well, on not the metropolis, that's a little bit of a failure, but the city itself, where they have planned and implemented 100% of the projects which are planned. This is a unique case, so it's good to study it. So you can have a multi-stakeholder participatory and an implementation. So they have implemented everything. So for those interested in planning, and when you look at the city, it's quite interesting from that side. So planning is possible, and it works much better. This city has been improving.
Just wanted to make a small addition to the point that you raised, which I think is very valid and very interesting. What happens with planning, as it's been said several times, is that it's associated with forms of enormous spatial segregation, historically, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, in the colonial period, but also in Latin America again, where planning has been the instrument par excellence of trying to segregate people, just through the use of land, essentially. So there's that legacy which we have to tackle. Now it has its advantages, I must say, if you're going to look cynically at it. And again, going back to the case of Colombia, what Colombian cities have done for the last 20, 30 years is cross-subsidizing for the use of basic services. So, cities typically will be divided into, or any area of a city will be one of 6 strata. If you're in stratum 6, then you pay the highest rate for water and sanitation and waste collection and so on. If you're in stratum 1, you pay a much, much lower rate, which is heavily subsidized by stratums 5 and 6. Now that's only possible because a city like Bogota, a city like Medellin is hugely segregated, especially. So there is, if you like, a positive legacy to that, in the sense that you can cross-subsidize. The trouble is that the World Bank, who's actually behind a lot of the loans behind that, is a sort of sworn enemy of subsidies, because they think that it goes to the wrong people. So there's a huge debate about that. Mm-hmm. So planning has that legacy, but I think you need to divorce also planning, which is land use planning, from what you were saying quite rightly, is the delivery of infrastructure, particularly networked infrastructure, you know, from roads to water and sanitation, energy and so on. And there, what you see in most interesting cities, again, is a separation between the two. So you may have a utility company which is actually charged with delivering their services, regardless of whether these areas are informal or formal. Provided there's a certain minimum level of legality, then you would supply them with water and sanitation or with energy. So the planning may be failing, but the utility service is not failing. And I think when it comes to actually whether the debate of whether planning is effective or not, yes, there is a dimension of that I was talking about, which is that enormous fragmentation. But in the end, whether people are regarded as informal or formal or legal or illegal, it doesn't matter as long as they have a certain degree of security of tenure, and that the city is able to supply them with the basic services. That's a crucial point. Now, planners are extremely conservative, and I mean, the work we did when I first joined DPU 1,000 years ago, some of my first work was in Zimbabwe, and we went for 2 years running with my colleagues, Michael Martin and Michael Safety, and I was actually shocked to see how unbelievably conservative Zimbabwean planners were. Absolutely unbelievably. I mean, when I told them that in Latin America the housing system was delivering plots of land which were 35 square meters, they were just shocked. For them, nothing below 250 square meters was actually possible in the city. So therein lies the sort of the big stumbling block is that enormous conservatism of which I think you were mentioning earlier about how the city ought to look. But if you divorce that from the actual delivery of what the population needs and the poor needs is important. The second point I wanted to make, is that planning, capital needs planning, and I agree with that. And a fantastic case is the case of Santiago de Chile, which at the height of, it's a country that really invented neoliberalism in practice, well before Mrs. Thatcher. And that's where the experiment really took off under Pinochet. And one of the parts of the experiment which was fascinating was actually that Santiago de Chile, the capital, lifted all, under pressure from the speculative capital, land capital, lifted all controls over planning for a period of about 3 years. By the end of these 3 years, these guys were calling for planning to come back because the chaos that ensued in terms of actually fighting for pieces of land and building wherever you liked and so on was too much for the capital to bear. So actually, even capital needs planning in some degree. And I'll make another point later.
For you, perhaps to explore a bit more this notion of segregation, because you've raised it before, and then I think your approach was we understand it differently, and I think in the way we see that planning is actually happening, but it responds to different interests, and I think spatially you can see it through, for example, in the peri-urban Accra, and I'm sure it happens in many cities, the pattern of gated communities, for example. That is a very structured planning mechanism creating completely different governing systems that have nothing to do with the rest of the city. So I'm sure that's I don't know if what you meant by that kind of segregation, not necessarily completely physical or even racial, like in Africa.
Yes, please.
That's a really useful entry point, thank you. And I think this itch about what is planning is the right one for us to be scratching if we're looking for alternative theoretical entry points into the city of the South and the African city in particular. And I like the discussion that evolved, which is, for me, planning as a profession and as an academic discourse is fascinating because it's been very static. But the practice of planning has evolved in very, very different ways. And that's, I think, what you're alluding to. There's a group down in Australia called RegNet, Regulation Network, who effectively do planning. They don't think of themselves as planners, and I like the way that they think, because some of what they put forward is the idea that there are multiple systems of regulation. And what's really important is how those multiple systems of regulation connect. And if you take Eve's point about planning still continues to be used as an instrument of domination, if you take your point which I think is so profound, that the middle classes plan themselves out. If you take Julio's point that there's kind of development from below, and Karen's point that actually what we are seeing is communities planning themselves. For me, the point about segregation is to be able to face what's on the formal statute books. Because I think what sets African cities apart from many other cities is that if you look at the UK's planning system, for example, it's dreadfully outmoded. It doesn't relate in practice to what's going on in a whole lot of ways. Okay? So it assumes local democracy, which equates to councils, which equates to major development interventions in cities. And yet we know that in practice it's much more complicated than that. They're big, special purpose vehicles that are set up that are totally unaccountable to anybody. London Olympic site would be a good example of that. There are any number of those really major events or entities that are there. But in theory, there is a single planning system. Okay? And regardless of who you are in a British city, you are entitled to the same rights at the local scale under the planning law. Okay? And so I'm not suggesting that it's perfect, and that's why I'm emphasizing the fact that actually under neoliberalism the state has been white-anted, and there are in fact multiple and parallel planning processes which take place. So, which I think erode citizens' democratic rights in particular kinds of ways. In the African context, I think it's particularly problematic because we don't understand, and Eve, your point about we simply haven't documented, I think is so profound. There are both multiple pre-existing systems of planning that the colonial system never displaced, traditional authorities being one. There are new superimposed systems of multinational corporations, so if Arab will just go in and build. There are the kinds of processes that you're talking about where the elite are, whether they're major shopping developments or whatever they are, that are deeply planned. Okay? But they are also, and this is the important point for me about the segregation question, it's a long-winded answer to your point, the formal system of planning remains differentiated in almost all African cities. Okay, so in slightly different kinds of ways, in slightly different contexts, and I'm not suggesting that there's a uniformity across all, but in almost all contexts, the so-called formal city and the so-called informal city are recognized to be separately planned. And that I think is, if not distinct, because I think lots of Indian and some Asian cities have similar kinds of characteristics. So I think across the board, planning has yet to catch up with and reinvent and rethink itself and reconfigure itself in ways which acknowledge this kind of multinodal, multi-site configuration of whether it's how infrastructure connects to the spatial planning process, or whether it's about how the delivery of services connects to local democratic processes of election or real political power and vested interests. But I think one of the problems for me is that we simply don't have a series of case studies which document that in a range of different cities so that we can begin to start theorizing it. Does it matter? I used to think it mattered terribly, and I clearly have centralist tendencies in my personality, and I have to sort of stop myself. It doesn't work. Don't go there. But the point is that if you get, for example, to the climate change question, and you do start asking about what is the public good, there do come moments when communities and local communities are not sufficient for the purpose of the stuff that I'm what you're alluding to. So my point about the segregation question, and I too am a Southern Africanist, and so I tend to think of segregation, my initial intellectual reference points are about racial residential segregation, but it's much more pervasive than that. It's about parallel systems of government, it's about parallel systems of control, it's about parallel systems of human settlement regulation, it's about parallel systems of access to power. Sometimes they connect, sometimes they don't connect, sometimes they're hidden, and sometimes they are on the statute books. And why I keep going back to saying just focusing down on informality isn't helpful, because what it does is, of course informality is important. How the informal is organized needs to be revealed. But if that's all we reveal, we're still going to only have a tiny piece of the picture of the jigsaw. So, and we need to understand how it connects to the other in important kinds of ways. I don't know if that helps.
Yes.
You mentioned one thing, where the form of democracy. I think that the issue of urban governance becomes also very important. The cases you gave on Zimbabwe as a dysfunction of a million people is very telling, because it's very difficult to imagine it happening in Senegal. It's very easy to imagine on Mugabe, and what was interesting even in Zimbabwe was that the people who were expelled were mostly Mozambican and Malawians. So it was easy to get away with it. These were displaced farm workers who had left the farm countries and went to the cities, and went to an area which was, by Zimbabwean rules, they should not have been there. The conservatism of Southern African cities is part of this labor reserve economy. These are, I just written a paper on taxation in Africa, and the tax structures of Africa today are exactly the same as they were in colonial days. The Southern Africans collect more taxes than, and so you'd expect, if the fiscal regimes looks the same, haven't changed, you shouldn't expect much to happen to the urban areas. So it continues on. And when people in Southern Africa say we don't want to lower our standards, and they want to maintain standards, they use that word, maintain standards. It means reproducing that model which they inherited and so. But I think we should do more work on what does democracy imply. Why, for instance, this was in the 70s, you go to Dakar, you would see, or the 80s, you would see little light bulbs in all kinds of strange neighborhoods. And you go to Ivory Coast, it was Abidjan, it was much richer, and there were areas with no electricity. And one explanation you could have was that there were elections in Senegal, there were no elections in Abidjan. Anyway, the point, I think we need to more work. What does it mean to democratize the cities? These urban elections, and do they mean anything? I think they mean something. There's in Lilongwe, Malawi, there's one part of Lilongwe which is called Matipati. It's a whole neighborhood, it's called Matipati. It only became feasible after elections because the new government allowed them to continue living there. So it's up to today it's called Matipati. So I think we need more work on what does this force of democratization mean for the urban areas in Africa, and maybe that's the link between planning and the social concerns. Maybe the democratic process.
I'm going to go to Charlotte and then come back to the panel. Yes.
So I want to pick up on something that Sue said. So you said the formal system of planning remains differentiated from the informal in Africa. And I think it's a really important statement, and it's a statement I'm not sure if I agree with, but I think it comes down to definitions of what do we mean by informal and what do we mean by formal. And that's something that's really being discussed and contested in the Asian context at the moment, but not so much in the African context. And the reason I say I'm not sure if I agree with you is I kind of think of low-income housing, again in southern Africa, that's formally planned but has all sorts of informal activity going on, has informal accommodation, has informal transactions. But then equally, I think to the other end, a few people have mentioned gated communities, and there's a number of gated communities in southern Africa that look very formal, but are breaking all sorts of planning rules and planning legislation, but are being allowed to operate through all sorts of deals that have gone on, that technically, depending on your definition, are informal. So, but appear to be formal and have all sorts of formal transaction processes going on. So I think we need to be really clear about our definition between formal and informal. And I think I'm not convinced that the differentiation is so clear-cut.
Just for the record, my point of departure in the lecture was to argue that we shouldn't be making the distinction between the formal and the informal for precisely this reason. And that the notion of segregation or differentiation was actually more useful. And I think that the point for me is that there are real and profound differences, and quite often it's around things like the zoning scheme and or the bulk infrastructure. So it's not visible. So the full or the taxation system. So my sense is that there are government processes which either include you or exclude you, and which put a cap on. They basically create a ceiling. So quite often it's taxation, whether it's around bulk infrastructure or whether it's around other kinds of service provision. And that was what I meant by preferring to go for the notion of segregation or differentiation rather than formality and informality, because I think that the way that the informal-formal debate has been construed is messy and unclear and tends to be quite moralistic rather than analytically informative, and it doesn't take us far.
Just to reinforce the point that and so you were mentioning about power and about democracy, and then trying to understand it within the context of decentralization, and this relates to planning to my point of view, because if planning remains as it is done today in the hands of technical and technocrats and planners, which has very little chances to be implemented beyond being at the service of some interests. And I would like to share with you an experience. I lived in Latin America, where there was an effort to link democratic process and planning process. And it was in Villa El Salvador, which is a large city, one could say, which is part of Lima. Villa El Salvador was the fruit of the largest invasion of land, or occupation of land, in the history of probably Latin America. Today is 400,000 inhabitants. And I remember the mayor and the organizations, they had a plan. They started the planning process, and they were wondering, should we have participatory budgeting? So they made something which is very interesting in terms of envisioning the city. What is the cities we want? Strategic planning in terms of creating a vision which should be inclusive of all parts. And they came with a long list of options of different scenarios. And then they decided, let's not do participatory budgeting or decide on investment, but have this plan being accountable for people, not as a technocratic tool, but as a true political tool. And they made the first referendum, like a political referendum in the city, to vote on the options which had gone out of the plan. So it became something that everybody knew. And I remember that it was 60% of the people, numbers which were similar to the one for elections, 60% of the people voted, which is absolutely tremendous for a plan, meaning that at least they knew what it was about. And the results were quite interesting about the priorities seen by the people. So it went out of the hands of the technocrats, or people like us, or professionals and technocrats, and or the political sphere, to become something which was accountable. It took not long, 2-3 months, not costing a lot, and the results were very clear. It's still the guiding principles now for investments, development of the district center of the district. It's the largest small-scale enterprise zone in probably Latin America, and for developing some priorities with participatory budgeting. So linking up democratic process with planning process and having it as a political tool and not only a technocratic tool was, I could see the enormous change and benefit the city had beyond the parties in charge, beyond the parties in place.
We talk about cities sometimes. We make the poor appear as if it's an alien space for them. That they are. I remember being in Senegal. Youssou N'Dour came up with a record. It was called Spatial. It was about cleaning up the city. Okay? And it was a big hit, and kids all over, all neighborhoods were out cleaning the streets and cleaning the city. And people talk like that. They will say our capital is dirty. There is a certain pride in seeing a clean city. It's not simply a middle-class bourgeois interest in seeing. and those costs are collective costs. And talking about that we have to realize that the poor are not alien to the city. Some of them are born there.
I'm very conscious that we've had this very wide-ranging and fascinating discussion about planning and the way in which cities are perceived and understood. We haven't touched much on the question of theorization and the production of knowledge. We've alluded to the fact that there's limited production of knowledge. And I wonder whether, just by way of closing, we shouldn't try to draw some of those issues that we've discussed, making reference at least in some way to that. And I'm going to start with Julio and give Sue the last word, so to speak.
Just one comment on that, and I think Sue's point about the urban theory that has been dominant in Europe and the North is unsuited to the global South. And what comes to mind is the work that one student of mine, a former student of mine, Ernesto Lopez, has been doing on gentrification, which I would recommend actually. His PhD dissertation can be downloaded from DPU's PhD website. Sort of plugging it there. But it's actually a fantastic piece of work. But it goes beyond that, because essentially just briefly what it does is to take Neil Smith's arguments about gentrification in New York, based in New York, and dismantle it, and sort of take it essentially to the context of Santiago de Chile. And what is clear is that what was missing from the theorization on gentrification was the community human element that he found in Santiago. What was very clear is that there was a movement by the planning, sort of micro-planning attempts to sort of essentially not quite evict people from central areas in Santiago, but evict them through the market. Because these areas that are pericentral, as he calls them, to the Santiago de Chile, where the land is quite valuable, where there has been a lot of community living there for at least 2 generations. And they would have been evicted according to this sort of plan, or sort of through liberal sort of market forces. And yet they fought to stay there. And so, in other words, what he's documenting is an alternative way of looking at these dominant narratives about the city. And he's now joined forces with a group of people around the world, including sort of his mate is a Korean, South Korean researcher who's based in South Korea and sort of shuttled between here and there, I think from the LSE in fact, looking at the same sort of idea, but in Korea. In other words, taking a theory which has been dominant and trying to sort of provincialize it or adapt it locally in a very interesting manner.
I'm going to ask Eve in particular, in summing up, to comment on one of the alternatives that you proposed, which was to try to understand these processes and linking planning and development through looking at the right to the city and whether that offers us any kind of ways forward.
Yes, if we reflect on theory, not only as a way to understand the world, but to transform it, I would say that today the cycle precisely is on the transformation. And those who are, to my opinion, precisely the more spearheading the reflection, theoretical reflection in the sense of a theory which explains and transforms the world in a positive sense. I'm absolutely impressed, and it was in Dakar, during the World Social Forum. We had lots of meetings of the international social movements and those struggling against evictions, for housing, etc., and on cooperativism. And so you had, frankly, a good half of Africa movements present, plus the rest. So what I say is that today, speaking only of a theory on Africa without delinking it from the international and global reflection on transformation of cities is insufficient, because it's very permeable. Through Skype there are always discussions. And what was interesting is that for one of the first time there was a very clear discussion on we should build the right to the city through the equivalent of La Via Campesina at rural level, which would be La Via Urbana, the urban way, and Via Urbana and they added, and we don't want only urban, because urban it's not enough, urban and community, La Via Urbana in Comunità. This is the name it took to be the equivalent. And they are very clearly working in the perspective of, very much of Lefebvre, of the right to the city. A city that is not owned by a few, but which can be appropriated by all, that I can use and I can build. And the fact of building is the exercise of my right to the city as a supreme right beyond the rights in the city. And it is quite interesting to say, we're not only interested in right to housing, but the right to the city, to something which we still have to build. Extremely vivid moment from, I'd say, good numbers, and I'm mentioning here in the World Social Forum, large networks like the Association of National Association of Cameroon dwellers. It's 1,300 organizations in the country. It's not small, you know, so the social movements exist. And I think that this is where theories are today being brewed. And we need, as intellectuals or researchers, to listen to the transformation process which are there in order to be able to explain and generalize the word. And then we can have a theory which is transformative and explanatory.
Except to say that I think that before I came to LSE, I was working in the UN in social policy, and I thought one of the most important part of urbanization, at least in the Western story, with industrialization, is that about the same time you begin talking about welfare state. The social question of Bismarck comes up precisely as we industrialize and urbanize, and the social question becomes an important part of the story. And you cannot understand, I think, the urban, that is, you cannot theorize the urban area without having to relate that to how this social question is seen in these countries. Because it's not really an urban physical, it's not an urban question, it is a social question. People have been moved to new areas, they are insecure, and that is the issue. And historically in Europe, it was addressed as a social question. And I think that's our push in that direction. Otherwise, you get kind of a space. The second part of the story, like that, within Africa, begin to think about what African elite think about the cities. When I was heading Codestria, my deputy was a Senegalese who was born in Dakar, and I was born in Bulawayo. So we thought we were urban. And in our executive committee, there were out of 10 people, there were 9 peasants. They were born in rural areas, but anyway, they were educated, and they refused to discuss urban issues. Every time we would say, let's put research on urban, they would say, no, this, they were interested maybe in the process of urbanization, but not the livelihoods of urban people, because we didn't exist. I think now there are a large number of people, and that it's possible to begin within Africa to seriously think about urban existence, not as transient, but as actual. Because much of the debate on Earth was very transient. People were being urbanized, and there's a vast amount of literature on that. But much of Africa now is permanently urban. It's not, and that I think will require rethinking about our view of the cities.
And I would completely agree with that. I mean, I think, and that for me is what the series I think has represented is when you start with the recognition of the urban, then you are able to begin a process of theorizing. And I think what we've had from the floor are all of the elements of what it takes to theorize. So whether it's Charlotte saying, how do we use this concept and what does this concept actually mean, or if it's a practical question about, so what does that imply and does what we have work? We can have an arts and crafts theory born formation. We start with what we have at our disposal. And one of the key tasks in theory making is empirical work, is to go and collect that information and to share our stories, because sometimes it's only when you begin to start sharing stories that you begin to see common threads or divergence, and that those outliers are as important as the commonality. And I think that for me is really, really useful. And I'm very pleased Cleo used the example of gentrification as my honours dissertation, my pre-master's work was a piece on the gentrification of Soweto in 1982. I was ahead of my time, if any of you have been to Soweto recently, because it has gentrified. In many of the ways that we actually thought that it might. So the point is not that theory belongs to a place, but that theory has to either illuminate, and Eva, I like your point about, for me, have a transformative capacity. It has to have a purpose. So it has to have a starting point, And that starting point has to actually be embedded in what is real. And that takes us in a way back, I think, to the recognition of the African city, of the African urban future, and whether or not our understanding of it is sufficient. And I think there we have to say we're wanting, but at least we hopefully are heading in the right direction. And I think that's not least, Karen, because of your efforts, so thank you.
Well, quite honestly, thank you. Because I think Sue has very expertly led us through some very, very interesting points and forced us to address some very, very interesting issues. So thank you so much, and it's wonderful to have you with us in London for the duration and to be able to share that. And I'd like to thank you all because we've had a very loyal audience here. All of you here have really come to all 3 sessions, and it's wonderful to have that continuity, and I think the contributions this evening were possible because of that. And I'd like to thank the panel very much for, I think, some very, very interesting issues that were raised, and the debate continues and the struggle continues. So, thank you very much, everyone.